Before sunrise at Kestrel Ridge Military Medical Center, a woman stood alone in the middle of the inspection yard while uniformed officers laughed. Colonel Harlan Drummond had ordered the drill, but what he hadn't ordered was what happened next. A sharp tug during equipment check ripped the back panel of her uniform away, and the entire courtyard fell silent. Across the nurse's back, running shoulder to shoulder blade, was a combat tattoo so precise, so specific, that two of the senior officers actually stepped backward. Not from disgust, from recognition, and from something that looked a lot like fear. If this story already has you leaning forward, subscribe right now, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The alarm on Maya Voss's phone went off at 4:15 in the morning, same as every day, and she was already awake. She didn't reach for coffee, didn't scroll her phone. She sat on the edge of the cot in her staff quarters, small room, concrete walls, single window facing the motor pool, and she breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 8 counts out. The box breathing had been drilled into her so deep it happened before conscious thought kicked in, which was the point. When conscious thought arrived late, you needed your body already in order. Outside, the base was shifting from night to pre-dawn. She could hear the change, generators cycling, distant footsteps on gravel, the low bark of a sergeant running pre-dawn PT with a unit she didn't recognize. Kestrel Ridge Military Medical Center sat on the edge of a high desert installation in a stretch of Nevada terrain that most GPS services still rendered as blank space. It was the kind of posting that nurses applied for when they wanted a quiet rotation, when they wanted to disappear for a while. Maya had applied for a different reason. She pulled on her uniform in the dark, methodical and practiced, creases sharp, collar flat. She checked her name tag, Whitmore, M, and adjusted it a fraction of a centimeter, not because anyone was watching, because the habit mattered more when no one was watching. At 4:45, she stepped into the corridor. The night shift supervisor, a heavy-set warrant officer named Gideon Pratt, looked up from his clipboard as she passed the nursing station. He had the expression of a man perpetually bracing for paperwork. "Whitmore, you're not on until 0600. "I know," she said, and kept walking. He watched her go with the mildly baffled look she'd been collecting from people since she arrived at Kestrel Ridge 6 weeks ago. She didn't explain herself. Explanations invited questions, and questions had a way of pulling threads. The medical ward at this hour was still and dim, the monitors casting pale blue light across the beds. 12 patients, none critical, all stable. She checked the charts of 3 soldiers she'd flagged the day before, a femur fracture recovering from surgery, a chest infection improving on antibiotics, a 19-year-old private dealing with what the intake form called acute stress response, and what everyone else called being a scared kid a long way from home. She adjusted this private's blanket without waking him, read the numbers, noted them, moved on. This was not the job she had been trained for. But she had learned, a long time ago, that the job you showed up to do and the job you were actually there to do were almost never the same thing. What? Colonel Harlan Drummond arrived at Kestrel Ridge like weather. You knew it was coming, you braced for it, and it was still worse than anticipated. Maya heard about the new commanding officer before she ever saw him. Staff talked, the way staff always did. Hard-charging, old school, does not like being questioned. The man had apparently transferred from a posting in the Pacific Theater with a reputation for running his installations the way a general runs a theater of war, with the understanding that everything in his field of vision belonged to him and existed to serve his objectives. He arrived on a Tuesday with 2 staff cars and a personal adjutant who walked 3 paces behind him at all times, clutching a tablet like a shield. Maya was drawing blood from a patient in Bay 4 when the colonel walked through the ward for the first time. She heard the shift in the room before she saw him. The way the nurses straightened, the way the orderlies found reasons to be somewhere else. She finished the draw, capped the vial, labeled it, and turned around. Colonel Drummond was standing 5 feet from her, looking at the bay with the particular expression of a man doing an inventory. He was tall, thick through the shoulders, with close-cropped silver hair and a jaw that suggested a lifelong habit of clenching. His uniform was immaculate. His ribbons were extensive. His eyes, when they found her, were the flat gray of old ice. "Who are you?" he said. "Nurse Whitmore, sir. Maya Whitmore." assigned to the medical ward 6 weeks ago. He looked at her name tag, then at her face, then back at the patient in the bed with the needle mark on his arm. You always run draws without a second person present? The patient requested I do it alone, sir. He has a documented history of, I don't need the medical history, Drummond said. I need compliance. Standard protocol exists for a reason. He said it to her, but his volume was calibrated for the rest of the ward. What's your background? Where'd you train? I completed my clinical training at Duren Medical Institute. Before that, I was Duren. He said it the way you'd say the name of a restaurant you'd had a bad meal at. Civilian program. Partially civilian, yes, sir. He walked past her without another word, moving toward the nursing station where Pratt was now standing very straight and looking like he wanted to become part of the wall. Maya turned back to her patient. The man in the bed, Corporal Danis, early 30s, recovering from a ruptured spleen, watched her with careful eyes. You always like that? Danis murmured. I wouldn't know, she said. He's new. You don't look bothered. She pressed a gauze pad to the puncture site and held it gently. I'm bothered, she said. I'm just quiet about it. The inspection was Drummond's idea. He announced it during the morning briefing 3 days after his arrival. Full equipment review, all personnel, 0500, the South Yard, nurses included. The medical staff exchanged looks around the briefing table. Equipment inspections were not unusual in themselves, but they were typically run by the facility's executive officer, not the commanding officer personally, and they were typically not conducted at 5 in the morning in an exposed outdoor yard in late October. Maya said nothing. She noted the time, mentally adjusted her morning routine, and moved on. The morning of the inspection was cold and clear, the desert sky still navy blue with a hard line of orange at the eastern edge. 52 personnel formed up in the yard, medics, nurses, lab techs, orderlies, ward clerks, while Drummond walked the line with his adjutant and 2 NCOs he'd apparently imported from his previous command. He worked through the line methodically. Uniform checks, ID checks, a cursory glance at equipment pouches. The kind of inspection designed less to evaluate readiness than to establish who was in charge. When he reached Maya, he stopped. She was standing correctly, eyes front, hands at her sides, posture exactly regulation. She'd seen officers like Drummond before, and she knew what the stop meant. It meant he'd been watching her from down the line, and something had irritated him, and now he was going to do something about it. Whitmore, he said. Sir. Your left sleeve is non-standard. He gestured to his adjutant, who stepped forward and reached for her sleeve without any preliminary. The adjutant, young, eager, transparently uncomfortable, fumbled with the cuff, trying to turn it to show the seam. He pulled too hard. The fabric in a regulation military uniform is durable, but the stitching at certain stress points on the older supply issue variant was substandard, and when the adjutant yanked, the back seam of Maya's uniform shirt split open from the collar to the middle of her back. The sound was small. The silence that followed it was not. Maya didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't reach back to cover herself. The cold air hit the skin of her back, and so did the stares of 51 people. Across the back of her left shoulder blade, running diagonally toward her spine, was a tattoo. Not decorative, not a nameplate or a memorial piece. It was a tactical emblem, geometric, dense with layered meaning for anyone trained to read it. A bird mid-dive, wings folded, inside a triangle with 3 hatch marks at each corner, framed by a sequence of numbers and a unit designation that most people in that yard wouldn't recognize. But most people wasn't everyone. At the far end of the formation, standing slightly apart from the others, was Commander Reeve Halston. Navy. Visiting Kestrel Ridge on a coordination mission that had nothing to do with the medical staff. He'd been watching the inspection with the relaxed attention of someone who was there out of obligation, not investment. When the uniform split, he went absolutely still. Drummond recovered first. He turned to the personnel around him, spread his hands slightly, and said, Well, I see the nursing staff takes its decorating seriously. 2 of the NCOs laughed. A few others followed, the uncomfortable laugh of people trying to calibrate which reaction would cost them least. Maya stood in the morning cold with her back exposed and her eyes forward and her breathing completely unaltered. Cover yourself, Whitmore, Drummond said, and report to the quartermaster for a regulation replacement. You're a disgrace to the uniform. He kept walking. She pulled the torn shirt closed with one hand. Behind her, she heard the footsteps of the formation shuffling, the inspection resuming. The laughter faded the way laughter does, quickly, because it was already embarrassed by itself. From across the yard, Reeve Halston watched her walk toward the quartermaster building without hurrying, without hunching, without giving any of the people still watching her the satisfaction of seeing what that moment had cost her. That woman, he thought, is not trained to survive embarrassment. She's trained to survive worse than this. The official story that went around the base by noon was that the new nurse had an illegal tattoo and had been cited for it. Drummond's adjutant, whose name was Corporal Wells, and who Maya had already decided she felt some sympathy for, had apparently filed a formal administrative note about non-regulation personal markings, which was technically accurate and strategically misleading in the way that administrative notes often were. Maya received her replacement uniform shirt, signed the form, thanked the quartermaster's clerk, and returned to her shift. 3 people asked her about the tattoo that morning. She told all 3 of them the same thing. Old story, nothing interesting. The first was Gideon Pratt, who was curious in the way of a man who collected other people's drama as a hobby. The second was a lab tech named Suki Farrand, who had actually seemed concerned, which Maya noted and filed away as something worth remembering. The third was a ward orderly whose name she'd never managed to learn, who asked while they were restocking the supply room, and whom she answered without breaking stride. None of them pressed. People rarely pressed when you delivered a no with enough quiet certainty. The aggression came from the words themselves, not from how you carried them. What she didn't tell any of them was what the tattoo meant. She didn't tell them that it was the emblem of a classified special operations unit designated Raven Company, not officially a company in the doctrinal sense, but a collection of individuals drawn from medical, intelligence, and special operations backgrounds, assembled for a specific operational purpose and disbanded, officially, 7 years ago, after a mission failure that had killed 4 people and wounded 2 more, and was currently classified at a level most of the people in that yard would never receive clearance to access. She didn't tell them that the Phantom Raven designation she'd carried for 3 years wasn't a call sign. It was a role, a function. The person who moved through denied environments when everyone else had been extracted, who collected intelligence under cover of care, who treated the wounded on both sides of a line because information lived in the trust you built with people who were bleeding. She didn't tell them any of that. She stocked the supply shelves in alphabetical order, noted that they were running low on hemostatic gauze again. She'd put in the requisition 3 times now, and went back to work. Drummond moved fast. She'd expected that. Men who needed control usually did because the window during which control could be established was narrow, and they knew it. By the end of his first week, he'd reorganized the duty rotation, reassigning 3 of the most experienced nurses to administrative roles that had no patient contact. He'd implemented a new check-in protocol that required double authorization for any procedure above basic triage, effectively tripling the time required to treat anything that wasn't a simple wound or minor illness. He'd reclassified the staff lounge as a briefing room, which meant no one had a place to sit during their half-hour breaks unless they went outside in the cold. These things were not illegal. They were not even unusual for a certain type of officer in a certain type of mood. They were, Maya understood, a landscape clearing operation. Drummond was making the environment uncomfortable enough that people would either comply completely or request transfers, leaving behind only the people who were either too junior to know they had options or too invested in their postings to leave. She did not request a transfer. On Thursday of his second week, she was assigned to inventory management, not assisting with it, doing it, solo. 3,000 items spread across 4 storage bays, each requiring a physical count against the digital record, which had not been reconciled in over a year. The assignment came through on a Tuesday evening. Maya read it, set down her coffee, and looked at the wall for approximately 2 seconds. Then she went and got started. Skifaran found her in the 3rd storage bay at 11:30 at night, standing on a rolling ladder with a clipboard and a pen light between her teeth, counting boxes of IV fluid. Whitmore. Suki stood in the doorway in civilian clothes, plainly off-duty, and therefore plainly here by choice. You know that's a week of work, right? Minimum. And they've given you 4 days. Maya took the pen light out of her mouth. I know. Why didn't you push back? Because it's Thursday, she said, which was not a real answer, and they both knew it. She climbed down from the ladder. Did you need something from this bay, Farand? Suki leaned against the doorframe and looked at her steadily. I looked up the tattoo, she said. On your back. The emblem. Maya's hands did not slow down on the clipboard. It didn't come up in any open database, Suki continued, which means it's either a personal thing with no documented origin, or it's something that's been scrubbed. And you don't seem like somebody who gets personal tattoos. People are surprising, Maya said. Sure. Suki was quiet for a moment. I've been in military medicine for 11 years. I know what people look like when they've been in bad situations. Not regular bad, the other kind. She paused. You have that look. Maya looked up. She looked at Suki Farrand, really looked at her for the first time since she'd filed her away under worth remembering. The woman was steady, not probing in the way of someone who wanted gossip, probing in the way of someone who'd already decided she was on a particular side and was trying to understand the terrain. You should go home, Maya said. You have an early shift. I know I do. Suki straightened. I'm going. She started toward the corridor, then stopped. For what it's worth, Pratt's in Drummond's ear, feeding him information about the nursing staff, who's unhappy, who's talking. You should know that. Maya wrote a number on her clipboard. I know, she said. Suki left. Maya climbed back up the ladder. Ocha. The tactical drill was not optional. The memo stated this explicitly, in boldface, under Colonel Drummond's signature. All medical personnel will participate in the live tactical readiness exercise on the following date. Non-participation without written medical authorization will result in administrative action. It was the kind of language that made people nervous, which was the point. Medical personnel were not expected to perform at infantry standards, but they were expected to demonstrate basic physical and procedural competency. And Drummond had apparently decided that this week's method of establishing dominance would be making nurses run obstacle courses in November. Maya arrived at the drill site, a section of the training facility's course area used primarily by combat medic candidates, at 0600. The other nursing staff arrived in clusters, looking variously resigned, resentful, and cold. There were 22 of them, plus 4 orderlies who had also been included in the memo, plus a handful of lab techs who stood apart and looked like they'd been included by accident. Commander Halston was there again, standing near the observation platform, coffee in hand, watching. Maya had noticed him at 3 separate points over the past 2 weeks, which was unusual for a visiting officer on a coordination mission whose presence should have been largely administrative. She filed this away. Drummond stood on the platform with 2 of his NCOs, looking at the assembled medical staff the way a sculptor looks at a block of stone, with the blunt question of what he could cut away. This morning, he said, you are going to demonstrate that you can function in a crisis environment. Not a clinical environment, not a comfortable hospital, a crisis environment. He paused for effect. Most of you will not perform well. That is expected. What is not acceptable is failing to try. The drill was in 3 sections. First, a 2-kilometer run with a pack weighing roughly 20 kilograms. Second, a navigation element, reading a terrain map and identifying a simulated casualty location. Third, a treatment station, where they'd be evaluated on their ability to assess and stabilize a training dummy while under simulated time pressure. For most of the medical staff, the 20-kilo pack run was the first problem. For a few, it was the map navigation. For 2 of the lab techs, it was apparently the concept of going outside. Maya finished the run 40 seconds ahead of the second-place finisher, which was a young medic named Torres who ran marathons in his free time and looked at her finish time with the expression of a man whose understanding of the world had just been revised. She completed the navigation element correctly, cleanly, and in a time that clocked below the standard set for combat medic candidates, not medical nurses. At the treatment station, they'd staged the dummy with a partially simulated penetrating chest wound, the kind of injury that would, in a real scenario, require an understanding of thoracic anatomy, fast tool selection, and the ability to sequence interventions under pressure. The evaluator, one of Drummond's NCOs, had clearly expected this to be where the nurses slowed down and looked helpless. Maya assessed the dummy in 4 seconds, identified the injury category in 2 more, reached for the chest seal and had it positioned correctly before the NCO's stopwatch had registered that she'd started. Wait, he said, you're using an occlusive seal. Yes. Standard protocol for this scenario is direct wound packing. Standard protocol for this scenario assumes the wound hasn't compromised the pleural cavity, she said, not looking up from the dummy. This wound has. You can see the breath sound differential in the simulated indicators. She gestured briefly. Direct packing would accelerate attention pneumo. Occlusive seal, vent position, then pack. The NCO was quiet. She finished, stood. The entire treatment sequence had taken 48 seconds. He marked something on his clipboard without looking at her. From the observation platform, Drummond watched. His expression had not changed, but he tapped his finger twice against his thigh. A small, reflexive gesture that Maya clocked and noted and understood. Not impressed. Threatened. Different thing entirely. From the edge of the observation platform, Reeve Halston set down his coffee cup very carefully and watched her walk back to the assembly area, her 20-kilo pack still on her back because no one had told her to put it down, and she hadn't bothered to without instruction. He pulled out his phone, typed something, put it away. The crisis came on a Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon, which was the middle of a regular shift change and therefore the worst possible time. A training vehicle, a logistics truck running supply routes between buildings on the installation, had a brake failure on the service road beside the east vehicle bay. The truck was not moving fast, but the road had a 6% grade, and the vehicle's momentum was enough. It rolled into a concrete barrier at the bottom of the grade. The driver and passenger survived without serious injury. The soldier standing at the supply dock, who'd been unloading crates, did not. Private Nate Ellison was 20 years old and had been at Kestrel Ridge for 6 weeks, which meant he and Maya had arrived at almost exactly the same time. She'd treated him once for a hand laceration, box cutter, supply bay, the kind of accident that happened when young soldiers were in a hurry. He'd called her ma'am with the exaggerated courtesy of someone who'd been raised to treat medical staff like teachers. He'd been pinned under the truck's bumper for approximately 90 seconds before bystanders got it off him. His left leg had absorbed most of the impact. From 20 meters away, Maya could already see the geometry of the injury. The way the leg was angled told her what she needed to know about what had happened to the femur, and more critically, what was happening to the blood vessels around it. She'd already been running before the call went out. The scene when she reached it was what scenes like this always were. People gathered, most of them frozen in the specific paralysis of wanting to help and not knowing how, a few of them doing the right things by instinct, and a few more doing the wrong things with total confidence. Someone had already started to move the leg. She stopped that immediately. Do not move the leg. She dropped beside Ellison. Nate, look at me. He was conscious, which was something. He was also in the category of shock that didn't look like shock yet. Pulse elevated, color okay, alertness still present. Because the body's compensatory mechanisms were working hard and would continue to work hard until they suddenly stopped. It doesn't hurt that much, he said, and the tone of mild confusion in his voice told her everything she needed to know about where his blood pressure was heading. That's normal. Keep talking to me. She was doing 3 things simultaneously: assessing the leg, checking his airway and breath sounds, and noting the absence of a medical bag in the vicinity. Does anyone have a kit? Someone call the ward. I need a trauma bag and a stretcher now. People moved. She kept her eyes on Ellison and her hands moving and her voice level. The femur fracture was significant. The vessel damage was her real concern. A mid-shaft fracture at that angle, with the compression pattern she was seeing in the soft tissue, had a reasonably high probability of vascular involvement, and if the femoral artery had been compromised, the window before irreversible damage was not long. She'd dealt with this before, in conditions substantially worse than a vehicle bay in Nevada. Torres had arrived with the trauma bag. Good, she'd remember that. And she worked through the stabilization sequence that was also a triage protocol, her hands operating slightly ahead of her verbal narration because she was narrating for the benefit of Torres and whoever else was close enough to learn something. Distal pulse check. Torres, I need you to find it at the dorsalis pedis. Tell me what you've got. I've got something. Weak. How weak? Like, almost not there. Okay. She thought for about 1 second. We need the OR prepped, and I need vascular on the phone right now. Not on their way. On the phone. She looked up and found the face of whoever was in charge of the gathering crowd. Who can make that call? Drummond had arrived. He was standing at the edge of the scene, watching her work. Colonel, she said, because protocol was protocol. We have a potential vascular injury. I need authorization to move this patient to surgical. The surgical is in a briefing, Drummond said. They're not to be disturbed for training accidents. The words landed. Torres looked at Maya. Maya looked at Drummond for exactly 2 seconds. Sir, with respect, this is not a training accident. This is a soldier with a probable vascular compromise in the lower extremity. If we don't address the vessel in the next 20 minutes, we are looking at permanent loss of function at minimum. She paused. At minimum. Are you telling me how to run my command, Whitmore? I am telling you the clinical situation, sir. The standoff lasted 4 seconds. It was Reeve Halston who broke it. He'd appeared at Drummond's left, quiet as a dropped signal, and he said 2 words at a volume audible only to Drummond and the 2 people nearest to him. Authorize it. It wasn't a request. Drummond's jaw worked. Then he looked at his adjutant and said, Tell surgical to get the OR ready, like he'd been planning to say it all along. Maya was already moving. The surgery took 2.5 hours. Maya wasn't the surgeon. That was Dr. Petra Holt, who had apparently been in a briefing that did not, in fact, prevent her from scrubbing in immediately when she heard what they had. Maya assisted. She stood across the table from Holt and handed instruments and answered questions. And at one point, when the vessel repair hit a complication that Holt verbally flagged as something I don't usually see in this pattern, Maya said quietly, Try the distal approach. Come at it from below the damage point. And after a 3-second pause, Holt did, and it worked. Holt looked at her across the surgical field. Where'd you learn that? Read it somewhere, Maya said. The look Holt gave her was not the look of someone who believed that. Ellison was in recovery by 5 o'clock. Holt told the assembled surgical team he had a good prognosis, assuming the vessel held, which she expected it would. She used the word excellent twice. Maya was in the scrub sink when Halston appeared in the doorway of the surgical suite anteroom. She registered him in her peripheral vision, kept scrubbing. You saved that kid's leg, he said. Holt saved his leg. I assisted. That's not what I saw. A pause. Where did you learn the distal approach? I know vascular surgeons who haven't seen that technique. She dried her hands, turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and an expression she recognized. Not curiosity, exactly. More like the particular alertness of someone assembling a picture from pieces and starting to understand what it was. I've worked in a lot of different environments, she said. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have. She moved toward the door, and he stepped aside to let her pass. She stopped when she was beside him, not looking at him. You called in a favor with the colonel this afternoon. I applied pressure, he said. There's a difference. What kind of pressure? He was quiet for a moment. The kind that works, he said. For now. She walked away down the corridor and didn't look back. Behind her, Halston pulled out his phone again. This time, what he typed was not a brief note. This time, it was a query to a system that most people at Kestrel Ridge didn't know existed, asking for a record search on a name that had 2 files attached to it. One current, one classified, one of which was stamped with the kind of notation that appeared on files for people the military had officially stopped tracking. Because they believed those people were dead. The response came back in 17 minutes. He stood in the corridor outside the surgical suite and read it twice. Then he stood very still for a long time, holding his phone, while the name Whitmore, Maya sat above a secondary file that carried a different name entirely, a call sign, technically inactive, flagged in the system as belonging to an operator last confirmed alive during a mission that the official record said had no survivors. His phone buzzed with a second notification, a follow-up from the same system, an alert that had apparently been set years ago, sitting dormant, that had just triggered because someone had run a search on the associated name. The alert said, if this file is accessed, verify location, asset may be in field. Halston read it a third time, looked up at the corridor where Maya Whitmore had walked away 90 seconds ago, calm, unhurried, unremarkable, everything about her designed to look like someone who belonged exactly where she was. Understood, then, in the way that certain understandings arrive fully formed, that nothing about the past 6 weeks at Kestrel Ridge had been coincidence. That the nurse everyone had spent the morning laughing at was not here because she'd been assigned here. That she had come here the way you came somewhere when you were hunting. Patient, quiet. willing to absorb whatever they threw at her because the thing she was actually doing required her to be underestimated. He looked back at his phone. In the database, next to the mission classification of the failed operation 7 years ago, there was a casualty list. 4 names marked KIA, 2 marked WIA, and 1 name, hers, marked with a notation that had apparently been entered in error and never corrected, because the person in question had simply never surfaced again to contradict it. Status: killed in action. Down the corridor, a door closed quietly, and Maya Whitmore was gone. The alert on Halston's phone stayed lit for 4 seconds before the screen went dark. He didn't move immediately. That was training too. The discipline of not reacting to information before you'd absorbed it properly, because the wrong reaction to correct information was sometimes worse than no reaction at all. He stood in the corridor outside the surgical suite and let what he now knew settle into place, the way you let your eyes adjust before moving through a dark room. Status: killed in action. Except she wasn't. She was 50 meters away behind a closed door, washing surgical residue off her forearms with the same economy of motion she brought to everything else. He put his phone in his pocket and walked in the opposite direction. Washing. Maya knew he'd run the search before she reached her quarters. She'd seen him reach for his phone. Twice. The second time with the particular stillness of someone who'd just received information that rearranged their understanding of a situation. She'd worked with enough intelligence personnel to recognize that stillness. It was the look of a mind doing fast, quiet work. She sat on her cot and looked at the wall and ran through her options the way she ran through everything, methodically, without panic, starting from the facts she knew and building outward. He'd found something. Probably the secondary file. Possibly the alert. If he'd found the alert, then he knew the file had a tripwire on it, which meant he'd understand she'd been in cover and hadn't surfaced by accident. He was Navy, which meant he had clearance channels she didn't fully know. He'd used the phrase "the kind that works" for now when describing his leverage over Drummond, which was the phrasing of a man who was accumulating pressure deliberately, not reacting to individual moments. The question was what he intended to do with what he'd found. She'd allowed for this possibility. Any undercover operation that ran long enough hit the moment when someone smart enough to read the signs ended up in the same room. The mission plan had contingencies for discovery. What it didn't have a clean contingency for was discovery by someone who might actually be useful. She lay back on the cot, stared at the ceiling. The mission was at roughly the 70% mark. She had documentary evidence on 11 of the 16 incidents she'd needed to document. The operational records she'd been reconstructing from fragments, cross-referenced against the supply logs she'd been inventorying in those storage bays, which was why she'd accepted that assignment without complaint, were close to complete. She needed 3 more weeks, maybe 4. Drummond had given her maybe 1. She'd seen the shift in him at the vehicle bay. The moment she'd publicly contradicted him in front of his NCOs, in front of Halston, in front of a gathering crowd. That was the moment the calculation changed. Before that, he'd been clearing the landscape, making her uncomfortable, waiting for her to leave. After that, he was going to move faster. She had approximately 48 hours before the administrative pressure became something that couldn't be worked around. She closed her eyes, breathed. 48 hours was workable. Probably. Drummond's next move came the following morning in the form of a reassignment memo. Maya was no longer on the medical ward. Effective immediately, she was assigned to equipment calibration. The process of physically rechecking the calibration records on every piece of diagnostic equipment in the facility, which ran to approximately 240 individual items, and was normally handled by the biomedical engineering team, not nursing staff. The reassignment was, technically, within his authority. It was also, functionally, a removal from patient care. She received the memo at 0700, read it, set it face down on the nurse's station counter. Suki Ferrand was standing 3 feet away and had plainly already read the copy that had gone to the ward supervisor. Her expression was controlled in the way of someone controlling it deliberately. "You going to file a grievance?" Suki asked. "No." "Maya, it's fine." "Fine." Maya picked up her coffee. "Who's covering my patients?" "Ramos, for now. But Ramos has 12 of his own. Make sure Danis in Bay 4 gets his morning labs before 10. He's been running slightly elevated on the inflammatory markers, and I want to see if it's trending or stable before anyone makes a call about extending his antibiotics." She drank the coffee. And the kid in Bay 7, the stress response case, he had a rough night. Don't let anyone minimize it. He needs actual conversation, not a checklist. Suki looked at her for a long moment. You're not going to fight this. Not the way you mean. She left the ward without looking back, which was becoming something of a habit. The biomedical equipment bay was in the basement of the facility's east wing, which most of the medical staff only visited when they needed to drop off malfunctioning equipment. It smelled like dust and machine oil, and the particular staleness of a room that had fluorescent lighting and no windows. And it was approximately as far from the center of activity at Kestrel Ridge as you could get, while still technically being inside the building. Maya arrived, found the master log, and started working. The calibration records were, predictably, a mess. Not falsified, just neglected. A facility this size, with this staff-to-equipment ratio, and a command structure that prioritized tactical readiness over administrative maintenance, was going to have documentation gaps. She found them, noted them, began the actual recalibration process where it was needed. What she also found, in the second hour, tucked inside the folder for a portable imaging unit that had been flagged as out of service for 11 months, was something that had nothing to do with biomedical calibration. It was a printout. Old. The paper had that particular stiffness of something that had been damp once and dried out. The text was partial. Half of it had been torn away. But the fragment that remained carried a date, a reference number, and 4 lines of administrative language that she recognized as the formatting of an operational debrief record. She read it twice. Her hands didn't shake. Then she put it in her jacket pocket, closed the folder, and kept working. By noon, she had completed 47 calibration checks and found a torn document fragment that was, if her reconstruction of its context was correct, a piece of the file she had been trying to locate for 7 years. Not the whole file, a corner of it, a thread. But threads were where everything started. Torres found her during the lunch hour. She'd expected Suki. Torres was a surprise. She'd clocked him as competent and decent, but hadn't placed him in the category of someone who would seek her out deliberately. He appeared in the doorway of the equipment bay looking like a man who'd had a small internal argument about whether to come and had recently lost it. Can I come in? Doors open. He came in. Looked at the rows of equipment, the logs spread across the work table, the methodical stacking of completed items on her left and pending items on her right. You've done half of these. A bit more than half. In one morning. I work fast when I'm not interrupted. She looked up. What do you need, Torres? He crossed his arms. I wanted to say something about yesterday. The drill or the surgery? Both. He paused. At the drill. The time you put up on the pack run. I run competitively. I know what those numbers mean. And the treatment sequence, the chest seal call. He stopped again. I've been in combat medic training. I know that technique. Most people in that yard don't. He looked at her steadily. Where did you actually train? I've answered that question. Durand Medical Institute doesn't teach field vascular surgery assists. No, she agreed. It doesn't. The silence stretched. Torres was young, maybe 26, with the build of someone who took care of himself and the eyes of someone who'd been in enough situations to have started learning from them. He was not, she decided, here because he was curious. He was here because something about yesterday had landed differently than information usually landed, and he was trying to understand what to do with it. Drummond's going to come after you, he said. I know. Whatever you're actually doing here, and I'm not asking, because I think you're not going to tell me, he's going to accelerate it now. You embarrassed him in front of Halston. I gave a clinical assessment in front of a senior officer, she said. He chose to experience that as embarrassment. That's a very careful way to say it. It's an accurate way to say it. Torres looked at her for another moment. Ellison's awake, he said. He asked about you. She felt something move through her, brief, small, the kind of thing she'd learned to register and set aside. Good, she said. Tell him to rest. He wants to thank you. He can thank the surgical team. She turned back to the log. Thanks for coming down, Torres. Close the door on your way out. He left. She wasn't sure if he'd close the door or not. He did. Halston came at 1400, which meant he'd been thinking about it since the night before and had spent the morning deciding how to approach it. He came alone, which she noted. No adjutant, no junior officer trailing him. He'd also changed out of his formal duty uniform into something more casual, still regulation, but field grade rather than administrative. The choice of clothing was a message, whether he'd intended it as one or not. He was trying to reduce the power differential. That told her something about how he planned to handle the conversation. He stood in the doorway and looked at the equipment bay and at her and said, "You knew I ran the search." "I suspected." "You didn't run. I had work to do." He came into the room and stopped at the edge of the work table, close enough to speak quietly. "Your file has a tripwire on it," he said. "I want to know who set it." "That's not a question I can answer here." "Can you answer it anywhere?" She set down her calibration tool and looked at him directly. "What do you want, Commander?" "I want to understand what's happening at this installation," he said, "because I have been here for 2 weeks on what was supposed to be a 3-day coordination visit, and the reason I'm still here is that something has been off at Kestrel Ridge in ways that don't show up on any official report. And now I've pulled a classified file on a nurse who is officially dead, and she is standing in a basement doing calibration checks, and I would like someone to explain to me what's going on." It was the longest she'd heard him speak at once. The controlled delivery of someone who'd been holding this back for a while and had decided that controlled release was better than the alternative. She measured him. The angle was different from how she'd measured everyone else here. Drummond she'd read immediately, aggressive, insecure, the kind of authority that needed to shrink others to maintain its size. Suki she'd read as principled, Torres as earnest. Halston was something more complicated, patient, perceptive, operating from a base of genuine institutional concern rather than personal ambition, but also clearly carrying his own agenda, his own reasons for being at Kestrel Ridge that went beyond whatever the coordination paperwork said. "Why are you actually here?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. "What?" 3-day coordination visit that became 2 weeks. "You're Navy. This is an Army medical facility. The overlap in your coordination brief should have taken a day and a half, maximum." She held his gaze. "Why are you still here?" The pause was 2 seconds long. "I received information about patterns at this installation that suggested irregular activity," he said. "I was asked to observe and report." "By who?" "That's not a question I can answer here." The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. His jaw did the same, equally slight. They stood in the basement of Kestrel Ridge Military Medical Center and recognized each other, which was its own kind of information. "I'm not ready to have this conversation," she said. "I know, I'm giving you the option." "That's not what I mean. I mean, I need more time. Specifically, I need the rest of this week." "Drummond is not going to give you the rest of this week." "I know that too." She picked up the calibration tool again. "I need you to do something." "That depends what it is." "I need you to do nothing," she said, "for 72 hours. Don't approach me, don't run additional searches, don't escalate whatever reporting you're doing. 72 hours. He was quiet for a moment. "And after 72 hours?" "After 72 hours, we'll see what there is to talk about." He looked at her for a long time. She kept working because the equipment wasn't going to calibrate itself, and because showing she was comfortable with silence was as important as anything she'd said. 72 hours, he said finally. He walked out without further commentary, and this time it was her who heard the door, and him who didn't look back. She had 41 hours. She knew that by the following morning, when the second memo arrived, not a reassignment this time, but a formal performance review notice. Drummond had filed a preliminary adverse action document, citing her conduct during the vehicle incident as unprofessional, her drill performance as inconsistent with her documented training background, which was a creative way of saying she'd performed too well, and her general attitude toward command authority as a pattern of concern. The document was precise enough to have been prepared with legal guidance. That told her Drummond had made calls, that he wasn't doing this alone, which she'd suspected, but now knew. She filed the notice in her bag, next to the torn document fragment from the imaging unit folder, and went to find Suki Farrand. Suki was in the break room, the room Drummond had reclassified as a briefing space, which everyone still used as a break room because there was nowhere else to go, eating something from a container that smelled like last night's rice and looked like this morning's regret. "I need to tell you something," Maya said, "and I need you to not ask questions you don't need answers to." Suki put down the container. "Okay." In approximately 24 to 48 hours, things here are going to get complicated. When they do, I need someone who can maintain continuity of patient care for the ward without me present. Without you present because you'll be not here, Maya said, for a period of time. I don't know exactly how long. Suki looked at her. Are you in danger? I'm in a situation. That's a yes. It's a situation, Maya said again. The patients are going to be fine, but they need someone who knows what I've been watching for. The inflammatory markers on Danis. The stress response case in Bay 7, whose name is actually Reyes and who mentioned a sister twice in our last conversation, which means he's thinking about home and should be encouraged to call. She paused. There's also a veteran in the long-term wing, room 14, who has been refusing certain medications. His chart says non-compliance. What's actually happening is that one of the pills makes him nauseous, and he hasn't told anyone because he thinks they'll judge him. If you split the dose and give him the second half with a larger meal, he'll take it. Suki was very still. You've been carrying all of this. It's the job. Most people's version of the job doesn't include memorizing which patients are thinking about their sisters. Maya looked at her hands. I know, she said. Most versions of the job don't. She stood. Can you cover it? Yes. No hesitation. Good. She moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Pratt's going to ask you what I said. If he does, tell him I was worried about handover documentation and wanted to make sure the ward notes were complete. She paused. Tell him I seem nervous. He'll like that. Suki's expression was somewhere between impressed and unsettled. Will you tell me later what this is actually about? If I can, Maya said. I'll try. She walked out, and Suki sat in the reclassified briefing room with her cold rice container and the specific feeling of watching someone she couldn't quite see clearly walk towards something she couldn't quite make out, with the certainty that whichever direction it went, it was going to be significant. The document fragment was the key she'd been looking for, but it was also a problem. The problem was this. The fragment was dated 18 months before the mission, which meant whatever it was a piece of, it predated the operational planning phase she'd been tracing, which meant the corruption didn't begin with the mission, which meant she'd been looking at the wrong starting point for 7 years. She sat in her quarters at 11:30 that night with the fragment on the cot beside her and a mental reconstruction of every piece of documentary evidence she'd gathered spread across her working memory like a physical map. She moved pieces, reoriented, followed the new line backward. And then, somewhere around midnight, she understood something she had not understood before. Drummond hadn't ordered the mission. He'd approved it, managed it, covered it up. But he hadn't originated it. Someone else had. Someone who'd been at a different level of command, whose involvement in the mission record she'd never found, because she'd been looking in the operational files rather than the administrative ones. Someone who was still active. She sat with that knowledge for a long time. When she moved again, it was to reach under her cot and retrieve a small radio device from inside a sealed equipment pouch she'd carried here from her previous posting, the kind of pouch that looked like a standard maintenance kit and contained, in a recessed compartment beneath the first layer of tools, a compact encrypted transmitter. She powered it on, keyed the frequency, sent a brief coded signal. Nothing came back. She tried again. Still nothing. She turned it off, returned it to the pouch, and lay back on the cot. The ceiling was the same concrete gray it always was. Outside, the desert wind had picked up, pushing against the window in the irregular way that made it sound, periodically, like something breathing. Her extraction channel was dark, which either meant the signal hadn't reached, or it had reached and no one was monitoring it, or there was a third possibility she wasn't ready to sit with yet. She stared at the ceiling and counted backward from 240, which was the number of equipment items she still needed to calibrate, and she turned the new piece of information over and over in her mind, the wrong starting point, the unknown originator, the administrative files she hadn't accessed yet, and she thought about the 72 hours she'd asked Halston for, and the 41 she actually had. A knock at her door, quiet. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. She was on her feet before the pause ended. She opened the door. Standing in the corridor in civilian clothes at 11:40 at night was Commander Reeve Halston. He had his hands at his sides, and his expression was the carefully neutral look of someone delivering news that wasn't good. Something's happened, he said. Tell me. Drummond filed the adverse action paperwork tonight. Full package. He's not going through the standard review process. He's going directly to the installation commander with a recommendation for immediate administrative separation. Halston paused. You're being removed from Kestrel Ridge, effective Oak 600 tomorrow. Maya absorbed this. And there's something else, he said. I ran a secondary query tonight, on the operational record from 7 years ago. His voice dropped slightly. Maya, I found a second name, someone whose involvement in the planning phase was documented in an administrative record that's been sitting in a non-indexed archive. She looked at him. Who? He said the name. The name was not Drummond's. She'd never heard it before. And somehow, standing in her doorway at midnight in a facility that was about to push her out the gate in 6 hours, that was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her since she'd arrived. The name was Brigadier General Warren Stale. Maya said nothing for 3 seconds. She stood in her doorway and looked at Halston and ran the name against every piece of operational memory she had, every briefing, every command signature, every voice on a radio she'd cataloged from the mission period, and came up empty. I don't know that name, she said. Most people don't. Halston kept his voice low. He's not in the operational chain you would have seen. He was in the administrative oversight structure, the layer above the mission authorization, the people who signed off on resource allocation and never appeared in field documentation. He paused. He retired 8 months after your mission, medical grounds. He's been in the private sector since. Defense contracting. Which contractor? Halston said the name. She knew it. A firm that held several support contracts with the installation's supply chain. The kind of firm that was everywhere and nowhere, that existed in the background of every major defense procurement cycle as a constant, unremarked presence. He's connected to Drummond, she said. It wasn't a question. Financially. There's a consultancy arrangement that technically complies with post-service employment regulations, and practically means Drummond has been managing facility operations in ways that benefited Stale's firm for the past 3 years. He paused. I didn't have the full picture until tonight. She looked at him. Why tonight? Because I ran the search you told me not to run, he said, and I'm not going to apologize for it. Maya leaned against the doorframe and looked at the floor for a moment. The corridor was empty, dim, the kind of quiet that only happened at this hour on an installation when the overnight duty personnel were settled into their posts and the base was running on maintenance mode. She had 6 hours. Come in, she said. Wong. She laid it out for him in 20 minutes. Not everything. She was not ready to give him everything, and even if she had been, some of it was not hers to give. But enough. The operational structure of what she'd been doing at Kestrel Ridge, the documentary reconstruction, the supply log cross-referencing that had taken her 3 weeks in the storage bays, the fragment she'd found in the imaging unit folder. She showed him the fragment without touching it because she'd been careful about prints and watched his face as he read it. This was sitting in a maintenance folder, he said, in a piece of equipment that's been flagged out of service for 11 months. No one opens those folders. If you're trying to hide something inside a working facility without destroying it, you put it in a place no one looks. He straightened. Someone kept this. Someone kept it either as insurance or because they couldn't bring themselves to destroy it entirely. She folded the fragment carefully back into its protective wrap. Those are different kinds of people, and they call for different approaches. Do you know which one? Not yet. Halston sat in the chair at the desk. There was only one chair. She'd been using the cot as a second surface, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes briefly. It was the first time she'd seen him do something that visibly human, and she noted it. Okay, he said. 6 hours. What do you need? Access to the Administrative Records Archive, Physical Archive, Sublevel 2, East Wing. I've been working around to it, but the calibration reassignment actually got me closer than the ward would have. She paused. I need 90 minutes in that room. It's locked. Key access only, monitored by the overnight security rotation. I know. That's why I need you. He looked at her steadily. If I pull the access and it gets logged, it will get logged, she said. I'm not asking you to hide it. I'm asking you to authorize it. On what grounds? Naval Coordination Review, Facility Operational Records. She met his eyes. Your Navy on a coordination visit. You have standing to request administrative access for operational verification purposes. It's unusual, but it's not outside your authority. He was quiet for a moment. And after you have what you need from the archive, then we have a conversation about extraction options. You mean leaving? I mean leaving with what I came for, in a way that ensures it holds up. He stood. I need 30 minutes to set the access up without triggering a duty supervisor notification. He moved toward the door. Be in the sublevel corridor at 0130. Halston. He stopped. If this goes sideways tonight, you need to be able to say you were running an independent coordination review. Don't tie yourself to me more than you have to. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to say something. He said it. 7 years ago, there was a forward surgical element operating in support of a classified mission in a denied zone. One of the wounded came back alive because a medic held a chest wound closed by hand for 4 hours while the extraction team found a route out. He paused. The wounded was a Navy officer. The extraction report says the medic's name was redacted from the official record at the medic's own request. He held her gaze. I was the wounded. Maya was still. I've been looking for that medic for 6 years, he said. I found a call sign in a dead file and followed it here. He opened the door. I'm tied to this whether I like it or not. See you at 0130. The door closed. She stood in the middle of the room and breathed, 4 in, 4 hold, 8 out, and allowed herself exactly 15 seconds to absorb what he'd just told her. The chest wound. The extraction. She remembered the name on the mission casualty list, Halston, R. WIA, extracted. And she remembered 4 hours on a hillside in the dark, with her hands doing the only thing that stood between a man she'd never met and a death that wasn't his yet. She hadn't known then whether he'd survived. The extraction team had taken him, and she'd gone back into the denied zone on foot, and the mission had collapsed 8 hours later, and she'd been listed as dead, and that had been the end of it. Except it hadn't been. She set the memory down with deliberate care, the way you set down something fragile when you need your hands for something else. She had work to do. The sublevel archive was everything she'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling shelving, banker's boxes organized by fiscal year, the particular institutional smell of paper and cold air that meant the climate control had been running for decades. The overhead lighting was fluorescent and aggressive. There was a single table in the center of the room, bare except for a sign-in log that she photographed without signing. Halston had pulled the access cleanly. The duty security officer who'd let her in had barely looked up from his desk. A senior NCO named Briggs, who had clearly been briefed on the coordination review access, and who either didn't care or was too tired at 0130 to perform caring. She had 90 minutes. She used the first 10 to orient herself to the filing system, which was a hybrid of digital reference and physical storage that predated the current records management software by about a decade. The digital index pointed to physical box locations. The physical boxes had not been fully reconciled with the digital index, which was the records version of the imaging unit folder, a maintenance gap that had become, over years, a place where things could sit quietly and not be found. She was looking for 3 things: resource allocation approvals from the 6-month period before the mission, personnel assignment records for the administrative oversight layer during that period, and any documentation with Stale's signature or identification number that touched the operational budget lines she'd been reconstructing from the supply logs. She found the first category in 40 minutes. The allocation records were incomplete, which was not itself evidence of anything. Incomplete records were the default state of most military administrative archives. But the incompleteness had a pattern. Specific line items, in specific fiscal quarters, had been removed from the physical files while remaining in the digital index. Someone had pulled the pages but hadn't updated the index, probably because updating the index would have created a digital record of the removal. She photographed the gaps, the empty folder sleeves, the index entries pointing to physical files that no longer existed. Then she found something they hadn't pulled. It was in a box labeled with a general administrative category that was broad enough to cover multiple subfunctions, tucked behind 3 other folders of genuinely routine material, and it was a single sheet, a resource reallocation authorization, signed by 2 people. One signature was partially obscured by a water stain. The other was clear. Warren Stale, Brigadier General, at the time of signing, dated 14 months before the mission. authorizing the reallocation of a specific budget line from medical logistics to a special operations support fund that, cross-referenced against the supply log fragments she'd already documented, fed directly into the mission's resource pool. She was looking at the money. The money that had funded the mission that had killed 4 people and been covered up as a training accident was traceable, through this document, to a budget authorization made by a man who officially had no connection to the operation. She photographed it 6 times from different angles, put it back exactly as she'd found it. Then she found the personnel records. Halston was waiting outside the sublevel corridor when she came out at 03:15, 45 minutes over the 90 she'd planned. He looked at her face and said nothing, which was the right call. They walked. Not to her quarters. She steered them toward the motor pool access corridor, which was the long way around, and gave them time to talk without being in a fixed location. "I have it," she said. "Enough?" "The financial authorization. Stale's signature on a resource reallocation that connects him directly to the mission funding." She kept walking. "Combined with what I already had on Drummond's operational management, the supply chain irregularities, and the debrief fragments, it holds." "Holds for what?" "For a formal investigation, a real one." She glanced at him. "The kind that doesn't get buried." He processed this. "The adverse action filing goes active in 2 hours and 45 minutes. If you're not separated from this installation by 0600, I won't be here at 0600, she said, "but not because I'm being separated." She stopped walking. They were in the motor pool corridor, which was empty and faintly echoing, the smell of vehicle exhaust and cold concrete underfoot. "I need to transmit what I have to a secure channel outside this installation's network. My own transmission device has been dark for the past 12 hours. I need an alternative." Halston was quiet. "You have a secure comms unit," she said. "I've seen the equipment case in your vehicle. Naval Coordination personnel carry field-grade encrypted communication for independent reporting. What you're asking me to do is transmit classified documentation through a channel that will be logged under my credentials." "Yes." "That's a significant exposure." "I know that." He looked at the ceiling briefly. "Who's the transmission going to?" She gave him a channel designation, a sequence of numbers and a protocol identifier that she'd memorized 7 years ago and had been carrying in her head every day since. His expression changed when she said it. A small shift, the kind that happened when something you'd heard referenced in classified briefings suddenly became a real thing standing in front of you in a motor pool corridor at 03 in the morning. "That's a defense oversight channel," he said. "That's IG territory." "Higher," she said, "and older." She met his eyes. "I was placed at Kestrel Ridge by people who needed someone inside this facility who could move without being seen. The channel I'm giving you is how I report back to those people. The transmission won't be traceable to you in any investigative sense. The encryption protocol strips the originating credentials on receipt. But yes, it will be logged under your ID on the transmission end." "Why didn't you use your own device?" "Because it went dark, and I don't know why it went dark. And a communication device with an unexplained failure is a security concern I can't afford to ignore." She paused. "If someone is monitoring for transmission attempts on that frequency, I didn't want it going out on a device that can be traced to me physically." He understood what she was saying and what she wasn't saying. "You think there's a leak?" "I think there might be. I think the document fragment in the imaging unit was either left there by someone trying to help me, or left there by someone who knew I'd find it and wanted to see what I'd do with it." She let that sit. "I haven't decided which yet." Halston was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You've been running this alone for a long time." "Yes." "That's—" He stopped. "What?" "I was going to say impressive," he said, "but that's not the right word. I don't know the right word." "Neither do I," she said. "So let's skip it. Will you transmit?" "Yes." The transmission went out at 0410. She stood beside Halston's vehicle in the secure bay area, watching the encrypted unit cycle through its authentication sequence, and she felt the particular held-breath quality of waiting for something you've been building toward for a very long time. She didn't let herself name it as relief. Not yet. Relief was for after. The acknowledgement signal came back in 8 minutes. A simple coded confirmation. The channel was live, the transmission had been received, The documentation was in the hands of the oversight structure she'd been trying to reach for 7 years. She breathed. "It's done," Halston said. "The first part," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "What's the second part?" "Now we wait for them to act. And while we wait," she glanced at the time on his watch. "In approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes, Drummond's adverse action goes live. Wells delivers the separation order. I'm walked to the gate. And that can't happen. It can't happen before the investigation is officially open," she said. "Once it's open and on record, the adverse action becomes retaliatory action against a cooperating witness, which is a different category of problem for Drummond." She paused. "The question is the gap, the window between now and when the investigation becomes official. How long does that take? Depends on who received the transmission and what their authorization level is." She moved toward the bay door. "If it's who I think it is, 8 hours, maybe 12. And you need to be unseparated from this installation for those 12 hours. Which means I need the adverse action stalled." He was already thinking ahead of her. "I can file a formal hold request," he said. "As the senior naval officer on a coordination visit, I have standing to request a 24-hour review period on any administrative action that affects personnel whose activities intersect with my coordination mandate." He paused. "It's a stretch. It's a legitimate stretch. Drummond will fight it. Drummond will lose it. That's different." She stopped in the doorway. "File it at 0530. 30 minutes before the action goes live. Don't tell anyone you're filing it until it's submitted. And between now and 0530, she looked at the base spreading out before her in the pre-dawn dark, the low buildings and the lit walkways and the motor pool, and beyond it, the medical facility where Danis was sleeping off surgery, and Reyes was thinking about his sister, and Ellison was alive because someone had made the right call about a vascular repair. "I need to do one more thing," she said. He waited. "The person who hid that fragment in the imaging unit, I need to find out who it was." She looked at him. "Because if it was someone trying to help, they need to know what's coming. And if it was someone setting a trap, then we need to know that before the investigation opens." "Yes." She left him there and walked back into the facility, which was just beginning its pre-dawn shift change. And she moved through it quietly, the way she'd moved through it every day for 6 weeks. Noticed, but not remarkable. Present, but not significant. The nurse nobody had bothered to understand. The equipment bay was empty at 0430. She went straight to the imaging unit, the one flagged out of service, shelf 4, east wall, and pulled the folder again. Not looking at the fragment this time, looking at the folder itself, the physical object. The folder had 2 paper clips on it, standard issue, the kind used throughout the facility, but the bottom clip had been bent slightly out of alignment and straightened again, the way a clip behaved when it had been removed and replaced. Someone had been in this folder before her. Recently. The paper still had the slight reorientation of pages that had been lifted and reinserted, not quite flush. She looked at the out-of-service tag on the equipment unit itself. The tag was dated, signed by the technician who'd flagged the unit, and stamped with a maintenance ID number. She photographed the tag, cross-referenced the maintenance ID in her memory against the names she'd cataloged since arriving at Kestrel Ridge. The maintenance ID number belonged to a biomedical engineering technician named Greer. She'd met him once, briefly, when she'd come to the equipment bay on her first day to sign in for her orientation. He'd have been the one to show her the master log. She thought back to that interaction. He'd been thorough, precise about the filing system, had volunteered, without being asked, that the best reference point for older records was the physical folders rather than the digital index because the index hasn't been kept up properly. At the time, she'd logged it as helpful. Now she logged it as something else. She found Greer at 0500 in the engineering workshop, which was in the same basement corridor as the equipment bay. I was 40 or so, compact, with the specific wariness of someone who had been careful for a long time and had developed it into a permanent posture. He looked up when she came in, and his wariness spiked. She saw it in the brief stillness before he controlled it. "Whitmore," he said. "Greer." She closed the door. "The imaging unit folder. You left the fragment there." He didn't deny it, didn't confirm it immediately either, just looked at her for a moment, measuring. "How long have you been here?" he said. 6 weeks. "How long did it take you to find it?" 37 days, she said. "I was doing inventory." He sat back, let out a breath that had clearly been held for a while. "I've been here for 4 years," he said. "I found that document in a shredding cycle that got interrupted. I don't know how it survived. I was going to destroy it, and then He stopped. "I couldn't, so I put it somewhere safe." "Why didn't you report it?" "Report it to who?" The question came out with the flatness of someone who'd already asked themselves that and run out of answers. "Drummond's been here 18 months. Before him there was a CO who was cozy with the same supply contractors. I filed an informal concern 3 years ago about irregularities in the biomedical procurement records, and the result was that my performance review that year had 3 new negative line items that hadn't been there before." He paused. "I learned to be quiet." "But you left the document." "I left it where someone careful would find it," he said. "I didn't know it would be you. I didn't know what you were. He paused. "Some people walk into a room and you can tell they're looking for something. You had that from day one." Maya looked at him for a moment. "I was not a threat." He was someone who'd done the best thing available to him with the resources he had, which was to preserve a document and hope the right person eventually walked into a basement. "Have you told anyone about the document?" she asked. "No one." "Has anyone approached you about me? Drummond's people or anyone else?" "Wells asked me 2 days ago whether I'd seen anything unusual in the equipment bay. I said no." "Good, keep saying that." She moved toward the door. "Greer, in a few hours things here are going to start moving. When they do, someone may come to talk to you. If that happens, tell the truth. All of it." She paused. "You've been holding this for 4 years. You don't need to hold it anymore." He looked at her. "Who's coming?" "People with the authority to do something about it." She left him in the workshop and moved back up through the basement corridor because it was 0517 and Halston needed to file in 13 minutes, and she needed to be visible, present, calm, unremarkable, in the corridor near the nursing station when Wells came to deliver the adverse action notice, because the visual of her standing there quietly when it happened mattered. The narrative of who she was at this installation had been written by Drummond, and the first step in rewriting it was controlling the moment when it became clear that she hadn't run. Wells appeared at 0558. He was a decent person doing a bad errand, which she'd understood about him from the beginning, and the particular misery on his face when he found her at the nurse's station confirmed it. He was holding a sealed envelope. "Whitmore," he said. I know what you have, Wells." She looked at him steadily. "Have you heard from Commander Halston this morning?" He frowned. "No, His radio cracked. He reached for it with the reflexive habit of someone who answered every call, listened, and his frown deepened into something more complicated. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the envelope, then at his radio. The commanders filed a coordination hold on all personnel administrative actions affecting anyone whose activities intersect with his mandate review. He said it slowly, like he was parsing a language he didn't fully understand. "That's unusual," she said. "Yes. Colonel Drummond is going to—" "I expect so." She picked up a chart from the station counter and looked at it. "Is there something you need me to sign, Wells?" He stood there for another moment with the envelope, looking like a man whose stage directions had been pulled without warning. Then he put the envelope in his pocket. "I'll need to check with the colonel," he said. "Of course," she said, and went back to the chart. He walked away fast. She allowed herself to exhale, once, slowly, and then Suki appeared from the ward corridor looking at her with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for the moment when the situation showed its shape. "It's moving," Suki said quietly. "Yes. Are you okay?" It was the question Maya had been asked the fewest times in her adult life, and she was never quite sure what to do with it. "I'm functional," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at Suki. "No," she admitted, "but it's what I have right now." Suki nodded, once, accepting that. "What do we do?" "You do your job," Maya said. "Exactly your job. Nothing else. Check on Donis, check on Reyes. Do not go near the administrative wing, and do not speak to Drummond or Wells if you can avoid it." "And you?" "I wait," she said, "and I stay visible." She was visible 2 hours later when the first black vehicle came through the installation gate, then a second, then a third, with federal plates. She was at the nurses' station, writing up documentation she didn't strictly need to write, when Drummond's voice came through the corridor. Loud, forceful, the voice of a man whose temperature had just spiked dangerously. She didn't move, kept writing. Torres appeared at the end of the corridor, moving fast, and he saw her and stopped and said, "There are federal investigators at the main entrance, and there's—" He paused. "There's a woman with them, civilian. She showed credentials to the gate officer and they just let them all in." Maya set down her pen. "What did the woman look like?" she asked. 50s, short hair. She had the kind of face that Torres struggled for the description. Like someone who's been making decisions about difficult things for a very long time and hasn't flinched yet. Maya stood up. "Okay. Who is she?" She came around the station counter and started toward the main corridor. "Someone I was hoping would show up," she said. "Eventually." Drummond's voice was getting louder. She could hear Wells trying to interpose something procedural, trying to slow it down, and she could hear it not working. She turned the corner and stopped. At the far end of the main corridor, Colonel Harlan Drummond stood with his adjutant and 2 of his NCOs, and he was looking at 4 federal investigators who had produced credentials that were making his face go through colors that weren't healthy. And beside the federal investigators stood a woman in a dark coat who Maya had last seen 7 years ago in a classified briefing room 2 days before the mission went active. The woman looked up the length of the corridor and found Maya immediately, the way people who were very good at their jobs found things immediately, and she held the look for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned to the lead federal investigator and said something, and the investigator nodded and started speaking to Drummond, and Drummond's face completed its journey through the color spectrum and arrived at the pale gray of a man who has just understood that the ground he was standing on has been gone for some time. From behind Maya, in the corridor, she heard a sound. She turned. Halston was standing there. He'd been watching. "Is that who I think it is?" he said quietly. "Depends on what you think," she said. "I think that's the Deputy Director of the Defense Investigations Command." He paused. "I think she came personally." "She did," Maya said. "Which means your oversight chain goes higher than IG." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "How long has this been authorized, this whole operation?" Maya looked back down the corridor where Drummond was now receiving documentation from the federal investigator, and the color had left his face entirely. "Since before I arrived," she said. "I just needed to finish building the case that was worth bringing her for." And then, from down the corridor, Colonel Drummond looked up from the documentation. He looked past the investigators, past the woman in the dark coat, and he found Maya at the far end of the hall. His expression did something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger, not bluster, the specific cold recognition of a man who has just understood, for the first time, who he has actually been dealing with. He took a step forward. His voice was low and careful in a way it never had been before. "Whitmore," he said, "what have you done?" She looked at him from the length of the corridor, and the nurse's station was behind her, and 7 years were behind that, and she did not raise her voice. "What I came here to do," she said. From beside Drummond, the lead federal investigator put a hand on his arm, not restraining him yet, but indicating the option was available, and said, "Colonel, I need you to come with us." And Drummond, for the first time since he'd arrived at Kestrel Ridge, did not argue. He went. But Maya's eyes moved, in the second before he turned away, to the woman in the dark coat, Deputy Director Nora Callum, who had sent her into this installation, and who had, apparently, been waiting for exactly the transmission that had gone out 4 hours ago. Callum was looking at her, and her expression, which was the expression of someone who had been making decisions about difficult things for a very long time without flinching, had shifted by a fraction that only someone looking for it would catch. It looked like relief. But Callum looked away too quickly and crossed to the investigative team and began speaking in a low voice to the lead officer, and Maya stood at the end of the corridor and felt the shift in the air that came when something long held finally began to move. Except. Halston was beside her again, and he said very quietly, "There's something wrong." She looked at him. "The third vehicle," he said, "the one with the federal plates. It's not DOJ. I ran the plate series in my head. That's a different agency." He paused. "That's not the team Callum came with. That's someone else, and they haven't come inside yet." Maya went still. "They've been parked at the gate for 11 minutes, Halston said. Just sitting. She looked down the corridor toward the main entrance. Through the glass of the entrance doors, she could see the parking area. She could see the first two vehicles, doors open, the investigators moving inside. And she could see the third vehicle, parked 40 meters back from the others, engine idling, no one getting out, waiting, watching. Who else knew about this operation? Halston said. And that was the question. That was exactly the question. And she didn't have an answer she trusted. And the third vehicle sat at the gate with its engine running, and she thought about her transmission device going dark. And she thought about the leak she hadn't been able to confirm. And she thought about Warren Stale and his defense contracting firm, who had been notified by someone, at some point, that the file with his signature was in the hands of the oversight chain. The engine of the third vehicle was still running. Her comms device was still dark. And somewhere in the facility behind her, somewhere in the administrative filing system, or the operational record, or the mind of someone who had been quietly watching her for 6 weeks, there was a piece of information she did not yet have, and she had the particular cold certainty that the person in the third vehicle had come to make sure she never got it. She moved first, not toward the entrance, not toward Callum, not toward Drummond being walked down the corridor with federal investigators bracketing him on both sides. She moved laterally, back through the nursing station corridor, fast but not running, the pace of someone with a destination rather than someone in flight. Halston fell in beside her without being asked. "Where are we going?" he said. "Sublevel, engineering workshop." "Greer." "Greer," she confirmed. The reasoning was simple and not comforting. If someone in the third vehicle had advanced knowledge of this operation, the most likely source was either the transmission itself, which the encryption protocol should have protected, or a human source inside the installation. And the only person inside Kestrel Ridge who knew what she'd been doing, who had held a piece of the evidence for 4 years, who had flagged his own presence to her by leaving a document where she'd find it, was a biomedical technician in a basement workshop who had just been told that people with authority were coming. She wasn't sure what she was afraid of yet. She was moving because movement was better than standing still when you didn't have the full picture. The sublevel corridor was empty. The workshop door was closed. She pushed it open without knocking. Greer was there. He was on his phone. He looked up when the door opened and his expression did something complicated. Surprise, then something closer to relief, then a flash of something she couldn't immediately categorize. He lowered the phone. "Who are you calling?" she said. "My wife," he said. There are federal vehicles outside. I could see them from the stairwell window. I was telling her I might be late tonight." She looked at him. He was a bad liar, but not in the way of someone concealing a conspiracy. In the way of someone who was frightened and trying to perform normalcy and failing at it. "Show me the call log," she said. He blinked. Then he held out the phone. The last call was to a contact labeled Diane, and it had been connected for 40 seconds before she'd opened the door. She handed it back. "Sorry," she said, and meant it. "What's happening up there?" he asked. "The investigation is open," she said. "Federal investigators are in the building. You're going to be contacted for a statement about what you found and when you found it." She held his gaze. "Tell them everything. Don't minimize it and don't add to it, just what you know." He nodded, the nod of someone who had been waiting for permission to stop being afraid. She turned to go. "Whitmore." She looked back. "The imaging unit," he said. "I checked it this morning, before the vehicles arrived. The fragment. It's gone." She went still. "Gone," she said. "The folder's empty?" "The folder's there. The fragment isn't." He paused. "I went back to check it because I was nervous after you came to see me. I wanted to make sure it was still—" He stopped. "Someone took it. Between last night and this morning." She had photographed it. 6 images from different angles, transmitted with the rest of the documentation to Callum's oversight channel 4 hours ago. The physical document was gone, but the photographs existed in a system well above anyone at Kestrel Ridge. That was not the problem. The problem was that someone had known where it was, which meant someone had known she'd found it, or had been monitoring the folder independently. Either way, there was a person inside this facility, not Drummond, who was currently being walked toward a conference room with federal credentials in his face, who had moved against her evidence in the window between 0300 and 0700 this morning. "Lock your workshop," she said to Greer. "Don't let anyone in except federal investigators who show credentials." Not facility security, not command staff. Federal only. She left him locking the door behind her. Well, Callum was in the facility's main conference room, which was the largest administrative space on the installation and which had been commandeered within 20 minutes of the federal team's arrival with the particular efficiency of people who had done this before. The door was closed. 2 investigators were stationed outside. Maya knocked. One of the investigators started to redirect her. The door opened from the inside. Callum looked at her and said, "Give us the room," to the investigator, who stepped aside. The conference room held 4 other people besides Callum, 2 investigators with laptops, a woman in uniform Maya didn't recognize, and Halston, who had apparently gotten there a different route. Callum made a brief gesture and the 2 investigators gathered their equipment and moved to the corridor without comment. The uniformed woman stayed. Callum didn't ask her to leave, which told Maya something about who she was. "The fragment is gone," Maya said, before Callum could open. Callum didn't react with surprise. "I know, we flagged a secondary access to the equipment bay on the overnight security log. 0247. She paused. 17 minutes after you left the sublevel. Someone followed me in. Someone came in after you. We don't know if they followed or if they were already aware of the folder's location." Callum's voice was the same as Maya remembered. Measured, dry. The voice of someone who processed information without spending emotional energy on it that was needed elsewhere. "The photographs you transmitted are intact and verified. The physical document being gone creates an evidentiary complication, not a collapse." "Who accessed the bay?" "The security log shows a maintenance credential. It's registered to a staff member who is currently on the access roster for sublevel areas." Callum looked at her directly. "The credential belongs to Warrant Officer Gideon Pratt." Maya absorbed this. Pratt, who had been in Drummond's ear since the beginning, who collected information about the nursing staff, who had looked at her with the mild curiosity of a man interested in other people's drama. Not curiosity, assessment. "How was the feed?" she said. "Not just relaying staff gossip to Drummond, actively monitoring." "It appears so." "Where is he now?" "We're locating him." A pause. "He's not at his posted duty station." The 3rd vehicle outside. She looked at Halston, who was standing near the window with his arms crossed, and the expression of someone who'd arrived at the same thought 2 seconds earlier. "The vehicle at the gate," she said to Callum. "We've run the plates," Callum said. "It's registered to a security consulting firm. The firm holds 2 active contracts with a defense technology company." She paused. "That company is a subsidiary of the parent organization where Warren Stale currently serves as a senior operational advisor." The room was quiet for a moment. "Stale sent someone," Maya said. "We believe so, yes." Callum's voice did not change. "The vehicle has not moved. The occupant has not identified themselves to the gate officer or attempted to enter the facility. They appear to be in a holding pattern." "Waiting for Pratt," Halston said. "That's our assessment." Callum looked at him, then back at Maya. "Which means Pratt either has something they need or is trying to get to something before we do." Maya thought about Pratt. Collected, organized, present in peripheral spaces where information moved. A warrant officer with sublevel access and 4 years of watching everyone around him. He knew this facility the way you knew a building you'd worked inside long enough. Not just the corridors, but the rhythms, the gaps. "The administrative archive," she said. "Sublevel 2, East Wing." She was moving before Callum could respond. The archive room door was open. Not forced, the lock mechanism was intact, which meant someone had used a key or an authorized credential. Inside, the lights were on. 3 of the banker's boxes had been pulled from the shelving and were stacked on the central table, lids off, contents disturbed. Pratt was not there. Maya scanned the room fast. Shelving, table, the disturbed boxes, the floor. Halston was beside her. 2 federal investigators arrived 30 seconds later, slightly winded. "He was here," she said. "Recently." The boxes on the table corresponded, by their fiscal year labels, to the period she'd been reconstructing, the same period she'd pulled records from the night before. "What was he looking for?" Halston said. She moved to the shelving, eyes running across the folders. She'd reorganized nothing. She'd photographed and replaced everything exactly, which meant the current state of the folders reflected what Pratt had done, not what she had done. She tracked the gaps. 2 folders missing entirely. She checked the digital index on the room's terminal. The missing folders covered budget authorizations for the same period as the resource reallocation document Sile had signed. Not the document she'd found and photographed. Different folders, adjacent months. If the reallocation authorization was a thread, these folders were the fabric it had been cut from. "He's not destroying them," she said slowly. "He's removing them. There's a difference." "He's taking them to the vehicle," Halston said. "Or he already has." She turned to the investigators. "The 3rd vehicle at the gate needs to be secured now. If those folders leave this installation..." One of the investigators was already on his radio. She pushed past them into the corridor and started toward the main entrance at a pace that wasn't quite running, but covered ground. Behind her, she could hear Halston keeping up, and the investigators calling ahead on their radios, and the particular escalation of noise that happened when a controlled situation started moving faster than the plan. So, Pratt was in the parking area. He was 30 feet from the 3rd vehicle, moving with the deliberate speed of someone trying not to look like he was hurrying, a document satchel under his arm. He had his head down. He hadn't seen the 2 investigators coming from the facility's east entrance until he was 15 feet from the vehicle, at which point he stopped. He stood there for a second and a half. She watched him calculate. And then he turned around. Maya was behind him. Not close, not blocking him, just present. He looked at her and the calculation ran through his face like weather. The satchel, the distance to the vehicle, the investigators to his left, the 3 other federal personnel coming from the main entrance, and Maya in front of him with no particular expression and no particular hurry. He set the satchel down. Not dramatically. He just set it on the pavement, carefully, the way you set something down when you've been carrying it too long and it started to hurt, and he straightened up and put his hands at his sides. "Whitmore," he said. "Pratt." She looked at the satchel. "How long?" He exhaled through his nose. "Long enough." He looked past her toward the federal investigators approaching from behind. "You know it doesn't end here. Sile has people in more places than you've found." "I know," she said. "That's not my problem today. Today's problem is handled." He looked at her for a moment. Really looked, the way he hadn't bothered to look in 6 weeks of watching her from peripheral positions. "I always thought you were too calm," he said. "From the first week. Nobody absorbs what Drummond was putting out that calm." "Some people do." "No," he said. "Some people suppress. You were different. You were..." He paused, searching for the word. "Patient." "Yes," she said. The investigators reached him. One asked him to step away from the satchel. He stepped. He didn't fight it, didn't argue, didn't perform any of the outrage that innocent people performed and guilty people occasionally did too. He was tired, she thought. The particular tired of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just put it down and found it wasn't a relief so much as a different kind of weight. She picked up the satchel herself, handed it to the investigator, and walked back inside. Maya registered that, the weight of it settling. "Your file," Callum said, "is being updated." A pause. "The KIA notation will be corrected by end of day." It was a bureaucratic statement about a bureaucratic correction. It was also, functionally, the official acknowledgement that she was alive. Not just present, but documented, restored, a person in the record rather than a name on a casualty list. She had been dead on paper for 7 years and would, by end of day, not be. "Okay," she said. Callum looked at her for a moment longer than the information required. "Are you all right?" "I'm functional." "That's the second time I've heard that answer today," Halston said from near the window, without looking up from whatever he was reading. "It's a consistent answer," Maya said. Callum, for the first time in Maya's memory, almost smiled. "We'll need your full debrief. Not today, but soon." "I know." "And your operation report. The complete reconstruction, every document, the cross-reference supply logs. It's all in the transmission," Maya said. "Everything I had is in the channel." "I know. I'm telling you, it's good work." Callum said it without ceremony, the way she said everything. Not as a compliment, but as an assessment. From Callum, an assessment was worth more than a compliment. Maya nodded, looked away. The facility moved through the rest of the morning. The way facilities moved through extraordinary events when the extraordinary part was largely invisible to most of the people inside them. The federal investigators occupied the conference rooms and the administrative wing. The installation commander held a brief all-hands communication that described a routine coordination review and asked personnel to continue their normal duties. The medical ward operated on its regular schedule. Maya went back to the ward, not because she'd been directed to, because it was where the patients were. She checked Danny's first. His inflammatory markers had leveled, stable, no extension of antibiotics needed. She found Suki at the station and told her. Suki looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had been maintaining a controlled weight and was now allowing themselves to breathe. "Are you going to tell me what happened?" Suki said. "Eventually," Maya said. "The short version is that it went the way it needed to." "That's vague." "It's accurate." She picked up the next chart. "Reyes. How was his night?" "He called his sister," Suki said. "About an hour ago. She's coming to visit next week." A pause. "He cried a little, the good kind." Maya looked at the chart. "Good," she said. She spent 2 hours in the ward, not doing anything dramatic, checking charts, adjusting a medication schedule, sitting with Ellison for 15 minutes when he woke up and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who had recently been much closer to a bad outcome than they'd understood in the moment. "They told me what you did," he said, "in surgery. Dr. Holt did the surgery. They said you made the call on the vascular approach." He was hoarse, young, looking at her from the recovery bed with the earnestness of someone who hadn't yet learned to perform gratitude at a distance. "I want to say thank you." "You don't have to." "I want to." She looked at him. "Rest," she said. "That's the thank you." He rested. Torres found her in the corridor outside the ward at midday. He'd clearly been tracking her movements with the patience of someone who'd been waiting for the right moment. "You want to tell me what's actually going on?" he said. "Not yet." "Not yet." He considered this. "Is it over?" "The first part." He was quiet for a moment. "Drummond's not coming back, is he?" It wasn't really a question. "No," she said. He exhaled. "The soldiers he reassigned, the 3 experienced nurses put on administrative, will they come back to the ward?" "That'll be up to the incoming command structure, but the reassignments were retaliatory, which is documented now. I'd expect they get reversed." She paused. "Make sure someone files the formal request. Don't let it get absorbed in the transition." He looked at her steadily. "You know more about how this works than any nurse I've ever met." "I've worked in a lot of different environments," she said, and he made the same face Halston had made when she'd said it before, the face of a man receiving a non-answer he'd already anticipated. "Right," he said. And then, "For what it's worth, the drill, the surgery. Watching you work these past 6 weeks." He paused, like he was editing himself in real time. "You made a lot of us better at our jobs just by being here, even when you wouldn't explain anything." She looked at him. He was sincere in the way of someone who found sincerity slightly uncomfortable but was doing it anyway because he thought it mattered. "Thank you, Torres," she said. He nodded, walked away. She stood in the corridor for a moment. The facility was operating around her. Footsteps, the distant sound of a monitor beeping a routine notification, someone laughing in the break room. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a place continuing. Callum found her at 1400 in the equipment bay, which was where she'd gone because the calibration work was genuinely unfinished and because she needed somewhere quiet to think. Callum stood in the doorway and looked at the rows of equipment and the log on the table and said, "You're doing the calibration work." "Someone has to." "We have an update on Sile." Callum came into the room. His firm's legal counsel contacted the investigators at 13:30. Proactive contact. A pause. "He's negotiating." Maya set down the calibration instrument. "He's going to cooperate." "It appears so. His counsel is framing it as providing context for the operational decisions of 7 years ago, which is the language people use when they're trying to control the terms of their own exposure." Callum's voice was even. "It won't give him the outcome he wants, but it means the investigation into the broader network accelerates." "The broader network," Maya said. "How broad?" Callum was quiet for a moment. "Broad enough that we're treating this as the beginning of a larger process rather than the resolution of a closed case." She paused. "I want to be honest with you about what that means." It means it's not over. It means the specific actors you came here to document are being processed. Drummond, Pratt, Stale, to whatever degree the cooperation agreement allows. What happened to your unit 7 years ago will be formally investigated with full evidentiary standing. A pause. But the system those actors operated within is still being mapped, which means the investigation continues. Maya looked at the calibration log. 47 items completed, 193 remaining. What are you asking me? She said. I'm not asking you anything today, Callum said. Today I'm informing you. Your official status is being restored. Your record is being corrected. You are no longer operating in any covert capacity at this installation. Your operation here is concluded, and I am not asking you to extend it. But in 6 weeks, or 6 months, when you've had time to, decompress is the wrong word, reset, Maya said. Reset, Callum agreed. There will be a conversation about what comes next, if you want to have it. Maya was quiet for a moment. The 4 people who died in that mission, she said. Their families? Do they know the investigation is open? Callum's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. We're notifying them today. Who's doing the notification? A DoD Victim Services officer, and let me be part of it, Maya said. Not the official notification. After. If the families want to talk to someone who was there. She paused. I owe them that. Callum looked at her. That's not a standard request. No. I'll see what can be arranged, Callum said, which from Callum meant yes. She started toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Commander Halston's role in this morning's events. The hold request. The transmission assistance. He exercised some significant discretion. He did. His command is going to want to understand why. He can explain it, Maya said. He's good at explaining things when he decides to. He told the investigative team that he had independent knowledge of irregularities at this installation. Callum paused. He also told them that 7 years ago, a Raven Company medic saved his life, and that when he found the file and understood what was happening, he made a judgment call. She held Maya's gaze. His command will review it. I expect they'll find his judgment was sound. Maya said nothing. Callum left. The equipment bay was quiet. Instruments on the shelves, the ambient hum of climate control, the log on the table with its columns of numbers. She picked up the calibration instrument and looked at it for a moment. Then she kept working. Drummond's formal interview concluded at 1600. The lead investigator, a compact woman named Vasquez, who moved and spoke with the economy of someone who'd conducted 1,000 of these, came to find Callum with a summary that Maya was in the room to hear, because Callum had not asked her to leave. The summary was this. Drummond had initially performed the posture of a man who had authority and intended to use it, which had lasted approximately 20 minutes before the documentary evidence was introduced. At that point, his attorney had intervened and requested a recess, and when they came back, Drummond's posture had shifted to the posture of a man trying to limit the perimeter of his exposure. He confirmed the relationship with Stale, confirmed the supply chain arrangements, confirmed that he'd been aware that certain personnel at Kestrel Ridge were reporting to Stale's network, and had not only allowed it but used those reports to manage the facility in ways that benefited the arrangement. What he resisted confirming, what his attorney worked hard to separate him from, was direct operational knowledge of the mission 7 years ago. His involvement was administrative. He had inherited a cover-up rather than designed it. That's true, Halston said from the other side of the conference table where he'd been sitting quietly. Vasquez looked at him, then at Callum, who gave a brief nod. It appears to be accurate, Vasquez said. Drummond came to Kestrel Ridge because of his relationship with Stale, not because of the original operation. He was managing the maintenance of a cover-up, not the original act. Which makes him complicit without being primary, Halston said. Which makes him a cooperating witness with significant value and limited principal culpability, Callum said. Which is not the same as innocence, but it affects the charge structure. Maya had been listening without speaking. She had learned a long time ago that the gap between what you wanted justice to look like and what justice actually looked like was one of the harder distances to cross, and she had decided years ago to cross it in pieces rather than all at once. Drummond had run a facility as an extension of a corruption network. He had systematically dismantled the working environment of every person under his command to serve that network's interests. He had tried to remove her specifically because she threatened it. He would face consequences for those things, real and documented ones, even if the word primary didn't apply to him. That was enough for today. She stood. Vasquez, she said. The three nurses Drummond reassigned to administrative roles. Their names are in his personnel action files. When the command transition happens, someone needs to flag those reassignments for reversal. Vasquez wrote something down. I'll make sure it's in the record. Maya left the conference room. In the corridor outside, she stopped and leaned against the wall for a moment. The fluorescent light above her buzzed faintly, a micro-vibration she'd been hearing for 6 weeks and had finally, today, stopped filtering out. The corridor smelled like industrial cleaner and whatever was being served in the cafeteria 2 wings over. She pressed her shoulders back against the wall and breathed. 4 in, 4 hold, 8 out. It was not over. Callum had been clear about that. Sile was negotiating, the network was still being mapped, and the investigation was the beginning of a process rather than the end of one. She understood all of that. But the thing she'd come here to do, the specific documented evidentiary case that her unit's deaths had not been an operational failure, but a betrayal funded and enabled by identifiable people making identifiable choices. That was in the hands of an oversight structure with the authority to do something with it. 7 years. She had been doing this for 7 years. She breathed. Down the corridor, a door opened and Halston came out. He saw her against the wall and came over and stood beside her without saying anything for a moment, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him. He knew how to occupy the same space without demanding it perform for him. Callum told me about your request, he said eventually. The families. She looked at the opposite wall. It's a hard thing to take on, he said. I know. You're going to do it anyway. Yes. He was quiet again. Then, the 4 who died, were they people you were close to? She considered the question, not whether to answer it, but how to answer it accurately. We were close the way you're close to people when you've been in difficult places together, she said, which is a different kind of close. You don't always know their middle names or what they wanted to be when they were young, but you know the things that matter more. She paused. I knew them in the ways that count. Yeah, he said. I know what you mean. She believed that he did. They stood in the corridor for another minute, and the facility ran its afternoon operations around them. And somewhere in a conference room, Drummond was charting the perimeter of his cooperation, and somewhere outside the city, a vehicle was reporting back to Warren Sile, and somewhere in a defense contracting firm, a man who had signed a resource reallocation document 14 months before 4 people died was talking to his lawyers. And then Halston's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression changed. What? She said. He looked up. Stile's cooperation agreement, he said slowly. The terms his counsel offered. Vasquez just sent me the summary. He paused. He's willing to provide full documentation of the original operational chain. Financial records, communication logs, the names of everyone involved in the authorization structure above him. He paused. In exchange for sealed testimony and a plea arrangement that doesn't include prison time. Maya looked at him. That's not the part, he said. The part is that in exchange for those terms, he also provided one additional piece of information, proactively. His counsel called it a gesture of good faith. He was reading from the message. Sile says that the mission that killed your unit was not a self-contained operation. It was a test case. Halston looked up. A test case for a program that was continued after the mission failed, under a different command structure, with different personnel. He paused. He's claiming the program is still active. The corridor was very quiet. Still active, she said. That's his claim. Halston's voice was careful. Vasquez is saying they can't verify it yet. It may be a negotiating tactic, inflating his value to the cooperation agreement by suggesting the scope is larger than what the documents show. Or it's true, Maya said. Or it's true. She stood away from the wall. The fluorescent light above her buzzed its small, persistent buzz. Who's in that program now, she said. If it's real. That's what Sile says he can tell them. Halston put his phone away. If the terms are agreed. She looked at the end of the corridor, at the door to the stairwell, beyond which was the basement, and the archive and the equipment bay where Greer had spent 4 years quietly preserving a document because he hadn't been able to bring himself to destroy it. Beyond which was the ward where Ellison was sleeping and Reyes had cried the good kind and Danis was stable. Stale had given them a thread. And if the thread was real, if the program that had killed her people was still running 7 years later, somewhere outside the perimeter of everything she'd spent 6 weeks documenting, then what she'd done here was not the end of something. It was the proof of concept. The thing that had been done to her unit, the betrayal, the cover-up, the 7 years. All of it had been designed to demonstrate that it was possible to hide something that large for that long. And if someone had taken that lesson and applied it, scaled it, continued it under different cover with different personnel and different funding channels. She stopped that thought. Not because it didn't matter, because it mattered too much to think about in a corridor at 4 in the afternoon on the day the first case had just been handed to the people with the authority to prosecute it. One thing at a time. That had always been the only way through. She looked at Halston. "Tell Vasquez," she said, "that if the program is real, Stale's cooperation agreement should include full disclosure with no redactions. Not a curated package. Everything." She paused. "If he gets to pick and choose what to hand over, he's still controlling the information. That's not cooperation. That's management." Halston nodded, pulled out his phone. She started walking. "Where are you going?" he said. "Back to the ward," she said. "I have patients." She paused without turning around. "And tell Vasquez one more thing. If the program is active and Stale knows who's running it, I want the name before the agreement is signed." He didn't ask why. He understood why. Because the last time a name had been kept from her, 4 people had died. She kept walking, and behind her she heard him make the call, and ahead of her the ward corridor opened with its familiar sounds and smells, and the particular human noise of people getting better in an ordinary room, and she walked into it and picked up a chart and got back to work. The chart in her hands was Private Reyes. She read the numbers without seeing them for a moment, and then she made herself see them, because that was the discipline. The ability to be where you were, with what was in front of you, regardless of what was happening in the larger frame. His inflammatory markers were clean. His sleep patterns, per the nursing notes, had stabilized. He'd eaten a full breakfast. She made a notation, returned the chart, and moved to the next one. Stale's name appeared in the public record 11 days later. The Defense Investigations Command issued a formal statement at 9 in the morning on a Thursday. The kind of statement that used careful, institutional language to describe things that had been, in reality, neither careful nor institutional. It named Warren Stale, retired Brigadier General, as a primary subject in an ongoing federal investigation into the misappropriation of classified operational resources, the falsification of military casualty records, and the coordinated suppression of evidence relating to a special operations mission conducted 7 years prior. It named Colonel Harlan Drummond as a secondary subject, charged with abuse of command authority, retaliation against protected personnel, and facilitation of an ongoing cover-up. It named Warrant Officer Gideon Pratt as a cooperating witness who had entered a plea agreement in exchange for full disclosure. The statement was 1 page long. It was, for the people who understood what it meant, enormous. Maya read it on her phone in the break room. The actual break room, which had been quietly unreclassified 2 days after Drummond's removal, with the sign-in sheet for the briefing room protocol appearing in the recycling bin shortly afterward. She read it twice, put her phone face down on the table, and looked at her coffee. Suki came in 3 minutes later, read the statement on her own phone, and sat down across from Maya without saying anything. They sat like that for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. "Is it enough?" Suki said finally. "It's a start," Maya said. "For a start, it's significant." "The families of the people who died. Have they been notified?" 2 weeks ago. Maya picked up her coffee. "I spoke with 2 of them, not officially, just as someone who was there." Suki looked at her. "How was that?" Maya thought about the phone calls, a mother in Ohio who had known, somehow, before Maya said anything beyond her name, and who had been angry in the way of someone who'd spent 7 years keeping anger banked at a manageable temperature. A brother in Texas who'd been very quiet for a long time and then asked simply, did she suffer? Maya had told him no, which was the truth, and which she was grateful to be able to say. "Hard," she said, "and necessary, mostly necessary." "Good," Suki said. "I mean, Not good, but right. Yeah, Maya said. Right. Drummond's formal charges were filed publicly 4 days after the DIC statement. The charge sheet was longer than one page. Abuse of command. Retaliatory administrative action gives an action against a cooperating federal asset. That phrase was Maya's official status now, formally and retroactively assigned for the duration of her operation at Kestrel Ridge. Facilitation of evidence suppression. Conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. The list was specific, procedural, and did not contain any language about dishonor or cowardice or the more satisfying words that didn't appear in legal documents. It didn't need to. The specificity was its own kind of language. He was removed from his quarters on the installation and transferred to a holding facility pending arraignment. Wells, who had delivered the adverse action notice that morning in the corridor with the expression of a man doing a bad errand, was cleared of involvement and reassigned to a different posting at his own request. He stopped by the nursing station before he left and said simply, "I should have pushed back," and Maya told him that the systems that produced people like Drummond were specifically designed to make pushing back feel impossible, and that the difference between complicity and survival was a harder line to draw than most people admitted, and that she hoped his next posting was better. He looked like he wanted to say more. She let him go instead. Pratt's cooperation agreement resulted in 3 additional names being added to the investigation. Mid-level administrative figures connected to Stile's network, who had been, for years, managing the financial channels that kept the cover-up funded. None of them were household names. None of them had faces that appeared in any public record. They were the machinery, not the engine. Sile himself, after 2 weeks of legal negotiation during which his counsel appeared to believe that the depth of his cooperation could offset the gravity of his actions, was informed that the terms of his agreement did not include immunity from criminal prosecution. Only the charge scope and sentencing recommendations were affected by his cooperation. The distinction mattered. He had, apparently, not understood it clearly until it was too late to renegotiate. Maya learned this from Callum, who delivered the information the same way she delivered everything, factually, with minimal editorializing, as though the collapse of a man's 7-year strategy for escaping accountability was a weather report rather than a reckoning. Maya appreciated that. The editorial was hers to make privately. She made it privately. She allowed herself a single quiet moment of something she wouldn't call satisfaction, because satisfaction implied the ending of something, and 4 people were still dead, and a program was still being mapped, and the world had not reorganized itself into a fairer shape. But there was a word for the feeling of watching the structure that had been built to make sure the truth never surfaced, finally, publicly, begin to come down. She didn't know the exact word. It felt like exhaling after holding your breath for longer than was safe. The installation's incoming commanding officer arrived on a Friday. Colonel Dina Marsh, Army, Medical Administration background, with the particular manner of someone who had been told she was inheriting a situation and had decided to understand it before managing it. She met with the senior staff individually in her first week. When she met with Maya, she had a folder on the table between them that Maya recognized as her personnel file. "Your assignment here," Marsh said, not as a question. "Was operational," Maya said. "The details are in the DIC record." "I've read the DIC record." Marsh looked at her. "I'm asking about the nursing, the patient care. That wasn't operational cover." Maya considered this. "No," she said. "That was the job." "You completed an inventory of 3,000 supply items, recalibrated 47 pieces of medical equipment, managed 11 patients with documented complex cases, and performed a vascular surgery assist that Dr. Holt described in her report as," Marsh glanced at the folder, "demonstrating a technical understanding of thoracic and vascular procedure that I have not encountered at this level outside of specialized surgical fellowship training." She paused. "While simultaneously running a federal undercover operation." "The inventory was actually useful," Maya said. "The records were a mess." Marsh looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. "The 3 nurses Drummond reassigned are being returned to the ward effective Monday," she said. "The adverse action files on all personnel affected by Drummond's administrative restructuring are being reviewed and expunged where warranted." She paused. "The reporting protocol for command conduct concerns is being restructured." All personnel will have access to a direct reporting channel outside the installation command structure. That's important, Maya said. The channel matters less than whether people believe it's actually safe to use. I know. Marsh held her gaze. I intend for it to be safe. A pause. Do you have a recommendation for how to communicate that credibly, given what happened here? It was a genuine question, from a senior officer to a nurse, asked without the performance of authority that would have made it rhetorical. Maya thought about it. Let the people who were affected by Drummond speak first, she said, in a format where their accounts are recorded and acted on visibly, not just noted. People believe a system is safe when they watch it protect someone, not when they're told it will. Marsh wrote something down. Noted, she said. What? Halston left Kestrel Ridge on a Wednesday, 3.5 weeks after the federal vehicles had come through the gate. His coordination visit had extended well beyond its original scope, which his command had apparently accepted with the resigned understanding of an organization that occasionally sent officers into situations that developed their own gravity. He found Maya in the equipment bay. She was finishing the calibration log, which she had decided to complete because it was unfinished, and because the habit of finishing things was one she wasn't prepared to let go of. And he stood in the doorway in his travel uniform with a bag on his shoulder. I'm leaving in an hour, he said. Safe travel. He stayed in the doorway. The program Sile mentioned, he said. The one he claims is still active. The investigators briefed me this morning. They've confirmed 2 of the 3 names he provided as current active personnel in a procurement oversight structure. He paused. It's real. She set down the calibration instrument. I know. Callum told me yesterday. She also told you what she's planning to do about it. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Are you going to be part of it? She looked at the calibration log. 47 checked items. 193 completed. The total, finally, correct. I haven't decided, she said. That's the honest answer. He nodded slowly. Fair. He looked at her for a moment. Can I say something? You're going to whether I say yes or not. Probably. He shifted his weight slightly. 7 years ago, on that hillside, I was not in a position to know who you were, or what you were doing there, or why. I only knew that someone was keeping me alive by staying when they could have left. He paused. I've been thinking about that a lot these past few weeks, about what it means to choose to stay when leaving is available. Another pause. You stayed here when you could have left. You stayed with Ellison when the faster option was to wait for someone else. You stayed with the families when no protocol required you to. He paused. That's not operational discipline. That's something else. She looked at him. What's your point, Halston? My point is that whatever you decide about what comes next, whether you go back in or whether you don't, the thing that makes you effective isn't the training. It's that. He met her eyes. Don't let them optimize it out of you. She held his gaze for a moment. Go catch your flight, she said. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. He turned to go. Halston. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. I'm glad you made it off that hillside. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and the moment was what it was. 2 people who had been in a dark place together, at different times, with the same result, and who had found each other on the other side of it. Yeah, he said. Me too. He left. She finished the calibration log. The official restoration of her record came on a Monday morning, delivered by Callum in person, rather than through administrative channels, which was unusual and which Maya understood as a deliberate choice. Callum sat across from her in the conference room. Empty now, no federal investigators, no institutional tension in the air, and slid a single document across the table. It was not the full record. The full record was hundreds of pages. This was the summary page. Her name, her service history, her rank and designation, and at the bottom where the KIA notation had been. Status corrected, active. Classification, defense asset, special operations medical intelligence. Below that, a second notation that had not been there before. Commendation recommended, Operation Reconstruction, Kestrel Ridge. Full citation pending classification review. She read it once, looked up. The citation will take time to process, Callum said. Classification review for anything touching the original mission is slow. I'm not in a hurry for a citation. I know you're not. Callum folded her hands on the table. The 4 members of your unit have also had their records updated. Their deaths have been officially reclassified from training accident to line of duty in a classified operation. Their families will receive the full survivor benefits they were denied when the accident classification was applied. She paused. It's retroactive. It includes back payment. Maya looked at the document on the table. 7 years of misfiled deaths. 7 years of families told it was an accident, told there was no story, told there was nothing to investigate because there was nothing to find. 7 years of a mother in Ohio keeping her anger banked at a manageable temperature because no one had given her anything solid enough to be angry at. Okay, she said. Her voice came out flat, which was what happened when something was too large for the voice to carry properly. Callum did not attempt to fill the space around it, which was one of the things Maya respected most about her. What do you need? Callum said. Right now? Right now. And after that? Maya thought about it genuinely. It was not a question she'd been asked much. Right now I need to finish the day, she said. After that? She paused. There are 6 patients on the ward who will have a new team coming in next week. I'd like to complete their handover documentation personally before the transition. Callum looked at her. I meant in terms of your next posting. I know what you meant. Maya picked up the document, looked at her own name on it. The corrected status. The designation she'd carried without documentation for 7 years now, sitting in an official record where it belonged. I'll call you at the end of the week. That's all I need, Callum said. But she finished the handover documentation over 2 days, because she was thorough, and because the patients had earned thoroughness. Danis, discharged with clean markers and strict instructions about his follow-up inflammatory screening. Reyes, transferred to a facility closer to his family, the chart annotated with a note about his sister's visit and what it had meant for his recovery. Ellison, whose leg was healing correctly, whose prognosis Holt had upgraded to excellent without qualifications, and who had asked Maya the day before her last shift whether she would still be here when he was fully mobile. She'd told him no. He'd said, I figured. And then, are you going to be somewhere you can be reached in case I want to? He'd stopped, working out how to say what he meant. I don't know. In case I want to write something, say something, when I've got the right words. You don't owe me anything, Ellison. I know I don't. That's not what this is. He looked at her with the directness of someone who was young enough to still say exactly what they meant. You're one of the people I'm going to remember. I want you to know that. She looked at him. 20 years old, leg wrapped, alive because of a 15-minute window and a correct clinical call, and a surgeon who'd trusted the direction she'd been given. Write it down when you have it, she said. I'll be somewhere. She did not give him a contact. She wasn't being cold. She was being honest. Where she was going next, and under what circumstances she could be reached, was not information she'd settled yet. But she believed him when he said he'd write it. And she believed in a way she didn't fully examine because it was the kind of thing that couldn't bear too much direct examination, that it would be worth reading when it arrived. Her last morning at Kestrel Ridge, she was in the ward at 5:30. Not on shift, just there. The pre-dawn quiet, the monitors cycling, the soft sounds of people sleeping. She stood at the nurses' station and looked at the bay numbers and the charts, and the particular dimness of the ward at this hour that made everything feel both small and significant. Suki found her there because Suki had apparently decided to come in early on Maya's last day, which was not something Maya had asked for, and which meant more because of that. You okay? Suki said. I keep getting asked that. Because people keep not knowing the answer. Maya looked at her. Suki was looking back with the combination of warmth and directness that had made Maya file her from day one under worth remembering. She had been right about that. I'm going to be okay, Maya said. That's the honest version. Future tense. It's an ongoing project. Suki smiled. Not the kind of smile that meant everything was fine, but the kind that meant she understood the difference between fine and functional and was willing to respect the gap. Where are you going? I don't know exactly. You know approximately. Maya was quiet for a moment. Somewhere there's work to do, she said. That's approximately. That's not a destination. No, she agreed. It's a direction. Suki looked at her for a long moment, and then she stepped forward and put her arms around her, briefly and firmly, the kind of contact that was not comfortable for everyone, but which Maya did not pull away from because Suki had spent 6 weeks being a decent person in difficult circumstances and had earned the gesture. "Take care of yourself," Suki said. "Not just the patients, you." Maya stepped back. "I know," she said. "I'm working on it." "What?" She left Kestrel Ridge at 0700 on a clear morning, the desert sky moving from orange to pale blue, the installation behind her running its early operations with the ordinary sounds of a place that was continuing. She carried a single bag. She didn't look back, not because it would have cost her something to look, but because what was behind her was already fully formed in her memory, and she didn't need the visual to keep it. The road out of the installation ran straight and flat for 3 miles before it curved south toward the highway. She drove the 3 miles without the radio on, and somewhere in the curve she thought about Ellison learning to walk on a leg that almost wasn't there anymore, and she thought about Reyes's sister boarding a plane, and she thought about Greer in his basement workshop, keeping a document for 4 years because he couldn't bring himself to destroy the only piece of evidence he'd found, and she thought about what it meant to do that, to hold something valuable in the dark and hope that eventually the right person walked in. She thought about that a lot, the things people held on to in the dark without any guarantee that it mattered, the decisions made in private, witnessed by no one, that turned out to matter anyway. She had spent 7 years in that dark herself, carrying her knowledge of what had happened and what had been done and who had done it, and she had not let go of it. Not when it was easier to let go. Not when being dead on paper meant she could simply stay dead on paper and build a different life. She hadn't let go because 4 people deserved more than a wrong notation on a suppressed file. That was not heroism. She was clear-eyed about that. Heroism was a word people used to describe choices that cost the chooser something, and she did not think of what she'd done as a cost. She thought of it as a debt. You didn't choose to pay a debt because you were brave. You chose because the alternative was a kind of compromise she had decided, early, she was not willing to live with. Not everyone had her resources. Not everyone had 7 years. Not everyone had the specific combination of training and access and stubborn refusal to accept the official version. She knew that. She was not arguing that her path was available to everyone. What she was arguing, if argue was the word, was this: that the quietest person in a room could be carrying the thing everyone else had decided was lost. That being underestimated was an inconvenience, and also, sometimes, an advantage. That the people who decided someone was not worth paying attention to were the people most vulnerable to being surprised. That patience, in the service of something true, was not weakness. It was the longest form of strength. The highway opened ahead of her. She accelerated. Callum would call at the end of the week. There would be a conversation about what came next, about the active program, about the name Sile had provided and what they connected to, and whether the person who had spent the last 6 weeks being mocked in a Nevada facility wanted to go back into the dark again. She didn't have the answer yet. She wasn't pretending she did. What she had was a corrected record with her name on it. 4 people whose deaths were finally documented as what they actually were. A mother in Ohio who had an answer she could be angry at. A young soldier's leg, working. A broken reporting system, being rebuilt. A man who had signed a resource allocation document and thought it would never be traced, being processed through a system he had believed was on his side. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything she had come for. The road ran straight toward the horizon, clear and long, and Maya Whitmore drove into the morning with the particular quality of someone who had been a ghost, and was not a ghost anymore. Not restored to something she'd lost, but moving forward into something she had not yet named, carrying only what she'd earned, and finding, in the silence of the open road, that it was enough to begin with.